All right, let's just dive right into this explainer. Look, if you've been following the headlines lately, you've definitely seen the massive hype surrounding the 2026 FIFA World Cup in Atlanta. It's everywhere. But today, we're going to look right past those glossy host committee brochures. We are digging deep into the actual economic data to follow the money, look at the real impact, and honestly, expose the cap behind these international mega events.
You've heard the pitch before, right? Host committees consistently sell these mega events to everyday taxpayers as this sort of universal economic lottery ticket. They tell the public that bringing in the world's biggest sports tournament is a rising tide that will lift all boats. They literally promise it's a transformative economic windfall that benefits absolutely everyone in the city.
Well, according to the economic data, that promise is absolute cap. The source material presents a wildly different reality on the ground. So today, we are going to break down the actual economic autopsy of this event to see who the data says actually cashes in and who really gets squeezed.
Part 1. The brutal autopsy. Let's take a look at the real winners and losers here.
The core dynamic at play here is just a stark, glaring contrast. Think about it. FIFA basically operates as an unchecked monopoly. All that revenue from broadcast rights, global corporate sponsorships, and astronomical ticket sales, it flows completely tax-free straight back to their headquarters in Zurich. Zero local tax. Meanwhile, local Atlanta taxpayers are forced to socialize the massive logistical and infrastructure costs. The city's police force, sanitation workers, and transit teams are essentially providing free labor and security to protect a private, global commercial empire. And the analysis shows exactly how this local wealth is extracted. Follow the money. Downtown mega hotels absolutely price gouged, quadrupling their room rates. But those massive windfalls didn't go to the housekeepers or line cooks making hourly wages. They largely went to out-of-state real estate investment trusts. And then you've got billionaire stadium owners like AMB Sports over at Mercedes-Benz Stadium. They secured multi-million-dollar permanent field upgrades, like switching to natural grass just for FIFA specs, largely funded by public-private host committee dollars. So the stadium retains these incredibly valuable permanent assets, and the city, well, the city retains the debt.
Now, I know what you're probably thinking. Doesn't the hotel tax cover all this? Officials claim that all the time, but the data shows this argument collapses instantly. It's a total myth. Hotel tax revenues are legally restricted and hyper-narrow in how they can be used. They literally cannot cover the hundreds of millions needed for emergency road repaving, massive transit strains, or overtime pay for thousands of security details. The sources point out that these massive expenses actively drain the city's core budget, diverting crucial funds right away from chronic issues like infrastructure and affordable housing. And it gets worse for everyday commerce. The sources outline this devastating phenomenon known as the ghost town effect. Basically, the city sets up these militarized security zones and blasts out warnings about severe gridlock, right? As a result, local residents panic and just completely avoid downtown and the surrounding neighborhoods. And those incoming soccer tourists, they strictly spend their money inside the official FIFA-sanctioned fan zones. Ultimately, neighborhood small businesses in places like Little Five Points or the West Side lose all their regular foot traffic and end up taking a net loss for the entire month.
So, let's tally up the scorecard here. It's pretty black and white. FIFA and corporate hotels walk away with massive, historic wins driven by tax-free revenue and guaranteed occupancy. Meanwhile, small local businesses and your everyday taxpayers take severe net losses due to customer displacement and completely drained public service budgets. According to the research, the 2026 World Cup was just an absolute masterclass in privatizing profits while socializing all the costs onto commuters, local businesses, and the unhoused who were frankly swept out of sight for the international cameras.
Moving on to Section 2, Zooming Out, the Atlanta Way and Structural Reality.
To really get this, we have to look at the bigger picture. And this number right here is honestly staggering. According to the research, the median net worth of white households in Atlanta is exactly 46 times higher than that of black households. Let that sink in. Over 1/3 of black households in the city have zero or even negative net worth. And incredibly, this structural inequality compounds even further when we look at upward mobility. Out of the 50 largest U.S. metropolitan areas, Harvard economists rank Atlanta dead last, 50th out of 50 for upward economic mobility, meaning a child born into a low-income household in Atlanta has less than a 5% chance of ever rising to the top quintile. So what does this actually look like on the ground? When contrasting capital accumulation with capital retention,
a glaring pattern emerges. A city hosts a mega event. Billions of dollars are generated in the downtown footprint, but that capital, it doesn't trickle into historically marginalized neighborhoods at all. Instead, that wealth is extracted outward to global bodies and out-of-state corporate headquarters. The research argues that municipal policy in Atlanta frequently acts as a bridge to de-risk private capital, basically prioritizing transient capital extraction over local intergenerational community wealth retention, all while those fundamental structural inequities, housing, wages, infrastructure, remain entirely unresolved.
Section 3, the root cause, the government metric vacuum.
So why does this keep happening? The sources point to a root cause known as the GDP trap. Because cities rarely define a measurable, quantitative mission statement for public value, like, say, explicitly aiming to increase median household wealth, they fall into a systemic failure mode. They substitute aggregate economic activity as a proxy for success. Basically, they measure the raw volume of capital flowing through the city, rather than how that capital is actually distributed or retained by the citizens who live there.
It's all about outputs versus outcomes. By confusing mere activity outputs with actual welfare outcomes, governments trick themselves. And they trick their taxpayers. They focus heavily on output metrics, like $1 billion in gross event revenue or massive construction valuations, instead of outcome metrics, like intergenerational wealth generation and upward mobility. And because the city tracks outputs instead of outcomes, a mega event gets logged as a massive civic victory on municipal ledgers, even when the data shows it's actively accelerating local displacement and draining public resources.
Which brings us to Section 4, redefining success, the social return on investment.
So how do we actually fix this? The proposed solution requires a major metric realignment. Instead of measuring gross tourism spend, the argument here is that a city must measure the net median wealth change for its bottom 40% of income earners. Make sense? Instead of bragging about total temporary jobs created for a 3-week tournament, they need to track the upward mobility rate. Instead of just tallying public infrastructure dollars dumped into stadiums, we must calculate the actual public asset ROI. And rather than just counting how many corporations were attracted to the city, we have to measure the community wealth retention ratio, meaning the actual percentage of spent capital that remains in the local economy.
Implementing these outcome-based metrics is a total game changer because it forces incredible accountability. It makes us ask the hard structural questions, like whose risk is actually being managed by these massive public subsidies? When our city grows, is that growth generating community wealth or just out-of-state extraction? And fundamentally, does our infrastructure spending serve the temporary visitors in town for a soccer match or the permanent residents who pay the taxes year-round? It essentially audits whether taking on public risk yields any measurable social return on investment.
Because at the end of the day, if a local government isn't actively measuring community wealth and mobility, the research suggests it defaults to acting as nothing more than an administrative steward for private capital. It exposes the ultimate cap of modern municipal governance. So I'm going to leave you with this final thought to apply to your own hometown. Without a measurable, quantifiable mission for public welfare, who is your city really working for?